Crossing the Great Divide. The mixed economy is a social institution, a human solution to human problems. Private capitalism and public coercion each predate modern prosperity. What was new was the marriage of large-scale profit-seeking activity, active democratic governance, and a deepened understanding of how markets work and when they work poorly. As in any marriage, the exact terms of the relationship changed over time. In an evolving world, social institutions need to adapt if they are to continue to serve their basic functions. Money, for example, is still doing what it has always done, providing a common metric, storing value, and facilitating exchange, but it's now paper or plastic rather than metal and more likely to pass from computer to computer than hand to hand. Similarly, the mixed economy is defined not by the specific forms it has taken, but by the specific functions it has served, overcoming market failures and translating economic growth into broad advances in human well-being. Okay, so this is, as the authors say, a definition of the mixed economy, although it's only a partial definition. Even if it can take different forms, the idea is that it's going to be a mixture between markets, that is, buyers and sellers, and the government. So that part of the definition is, where was that? 71. Okay, so that part's not included here. The effective performance of these functions has delivered truly miraculous breakthroughs. Indeed, the mixed economy may well be the greatest invention in history. It is also a strikingly recent invention. Plot the growth of Western economies on an axis against the passage of time, and the line would be mostly flat for thousands of years. Even the emergence of capitalism, momentous as it was not synonymous with the birth of mass prosperity. Trapped in a Malthusian race between population and sustenance, societies remained on the brink of destitution until well into the 19th century. Okay, so Malthusian means, well, basically having to do with overpopulation or the relationship between population and maybe too much population and the resources needed to sustain a population, in particular food. And this comes from the name Malthus, who was a guy who lived, I think, in the 1700s. Okay, so trapped in a Malthusian race, societies remained on the brink of destitution until well into the 19th century. Life expectancy rose only modestly between the Neolithic period, starting around 10,000 BC, and the Victorian era, which ended in 1901. An American born in the late 19th century had an average life expectancy of around 45 years, and a large share of Americans never made it past their first birthdays. Then something remarkable happened. In countries on the frontier of economic development, human health began to improve rapidly, education levels shot up, and standards of living began to grow and grow. Within a century, life expectancies had increased by 2/3. Average years of schooling had gone from single to double digits, and the productivity of workers and the pay they took home had doubled and then doubled again. With the United States leading the way, the rich world crossed a great divide. Okay, so this is an important term to remember. So the Great Divide is the divide separating centuries of slow growth, poor health, and anemic technical progress, that is slow technical progress, from one of hitherto undreamed of material comfort and seemingly limitless economic potential. For the first time, rich countries experienced economic development that was both broad and deep, reaching all major segments of society and producing not just greater material comfort, but also fundamental transformations in the health and life chances of those it touched. Okay, so one thing to keep in mind here is before crossing the Great Divide, on the earlier side of the Great Divide, there was economic growth. There was the Industrial Revolution, so nations themselves were starting to become much wealthier at that point. But what the authors are saying is that upon crossing the Great Divide, it's not just that some people or countries as a whole are getting wealthier, but all, or at least most of society is getting richer and also healthier, happier, living longer. So it's broad economic and just general well-being that's improving. Okay, the mixed economy lay at the heart of this success in the United States, no less than in other Western nations. Capitalism played an essential role, but it was not the new entrant on the economic stage. Okay, so as I just said, capitalism exists before anyone crosses the Great Divide. Capitalism wasn't new, rather, effective governance was new. Public health measures made cities engines of innovation rather than incubators of illness. The meteoric expansion of public education increased not only individual opportunity, but also the economic potential of entire societies. Investment in science, higher education, and defense spearheaded breakthroughs in medicine, transportation, and technology. Overarching rules and institutions tamed unstable financial markets and turned boom-bust cycles into more manageable ups and downs. Protections against excessive insecurity and abject destitution encouraged the forward-looking investments and social integration that sustained growth required. The mixed economy was a spectacularly positive-sum bargain. That is, it was a bargain where both sides benefited. It redistributed power and resources, but as its impacts broadened, virtually everyone was made massively better off. Okay, so right here I took out an image for the purpose of printing this. In nations where the mixed economy took hold, the economy underwent spectacular growth. Not coincidentally, government did too. Indeed, it grew even more quickly. At the end of the 19th century, government spending at all levels accounted for around $1 in $10 of output in the wealthiest nations. By the end of the 20th, it averaged over $4 in $10, with the public sector accounting for $6 in $10 of GDP in the highest spending rich nations. Okay, so when the authors say this, well, actually first, so GDP, as you may know, is gross domestic product. So that's the value in dollars or whatever currency of all of the goods and services produced within a country in a given year. Okay, so the authors don't mean that governments are producing 40 or 60% of what's being counted in GDP. Government is, of course, producing or at least providing some services that will be counted in GDP. So the government provides all of the military, provides the services that we get from fire departments and police departments, VA hospitals. So that stuff will be counted in GDP. But the authors are also counting, I believe, other instances where government spending is involved, but the government isn't providing the goods or the services. So on the one hand, you have VA hospitals where the government is providing the service, but then you also have Medicare and Medicaid where the government is paying, but the service is being provided by a private hospital. So they're counting any way in which government is involved in GDP, whether it's providing the goods or services or paying someone else to provide the goods or services. So that's what the 40 or 60% is. Not that the government is directly responsible for 40 or 60% of GDP. In some ways, these numbers overstate government's size, since much of government spending essentially shifts private income from one person or household to another, rather than financing goods or services directly. Okay, so I guess there are some examples of that at the bottom of page 78. I think that might be Medicare and Medicaid, which I was just talking about, as well as Social Security, which is a good example because there, you, while you're working, pay into that, and then you, when you're retired, get that same money back, more or less. Might be a little more, might be a little less, might be the same amount. So we think of Social Security as government spending, but in a sense, and this is simplifying things a little bit, it's just collecting, holding, and then giving you back your money, although that's a simplification. Yet standard measures also understate the size of government. because they don't include many of the ways the government affects the economy, from regulation to protections against risk to the provision of legal safeguards. Okay, so these would be non-spending ways that the government, hopefully positively, affects the economy. Suffice it to say that for all their imperfections and ambiguities, the numbers capture something real. Government has grown much bigger. Before looking at statistics such as these, one might assume that poor countries have large governments, at least compared with the size of their puny economies, and rich countries have small governments. After all, there are a couple of big tasks that governments have to do just to remain governments. Provide at least a modicum of protection, that is a small amount of protection, against internal violence and protect against external threats. These are pretty much fixed costs, that is providing those kinds of protections, or at least costs that vary within country and population size, far more than economic heft. So one might expect that as the economy grows, the relative size of the state, that is the government, shrinks. But that is not at all what happened. The richest countries expanded their governments the most. They upped their public spending dramatically during the period in which they grew most quickly, issued more regulations, expanded their legal systems, and offered implicit and explicit guarantees to private actors, that is, citizens, that were costless on paper but almost incalculably valuable in practice, such as serving as lenders of last resort. Modern growth occurred where, and only where, activist government emerged, and therein lies a big clue as to why the Great Divide was crossed. Okay, so again, you don't want to forget what the Great Divide means, defined on page 74. Perhaps the most important thing that big states started doing was educating their citizens. Modern growth commenced when people rapidly increased their ability to do more with less. They were able to do more because they knew more, and they knew more in part because they were taught more. The beneficial forms of what the economist Robert Solow famously called technical change, the ideas and innovations that allow people to be more productive, rest on widespread public education that seeds scientific advances and equips workers with new skills. Indeed, economists have concluded that roughly a third of rising productivity is tied directly to increased education, with most of the rest due to general advances in knowledge. Government was no less crucial to another pillar of modern prosperity, the physical infrastructure that helped make the scientific infrastructure possible and productive. Okay, so for this you can think, for instance, of roads and bridges, airports. Even before rich countries came to depend on public investments in science and technology for rapid growth, they depended on public investments in transportation and communications networks that linked together producers and their suppliers and their customers. Among other benefits, public infrastructure facilitated the rapid flow of materials and people across long distances, allowed manufacturers to benefit from economies of scale that supported modern assembly line techniques, permitted innovations to diffuse and goods to reach far-flung consumers, and created opportunities for workers to find jobs that matched their skills. The logic of government intervention. Why does it take a lot of government to get and keep prosperity? Because government has unique capacities to enforce compliance, constrain or encourage action, and protect citizens from private predation, that is, from being preyed upon. Because government has unique capacities that allow it to solve problems that markets can't solve on their own. These problems are both economic and political. They concern areas in which markets tend to fall short and areas where market actors tend to distort democratic processes in pursuit of private advantage. And even beyond correcting market failures, government can play an important role in helping markets do better at serving human needs. Okay, so I already pointed these out to you. We have on 77 and 78 4 ways in which markets can fail, and it's only really the government that can correct those failures. Okay, so first, one important market failure comes in the underprovision of what economists call public goods. These are valuable things that must be provided to everyone or to no one. The classic example is a lighthouse. Its light is available to all ships navigating a coastline, There's no cost-effective way to limit the lighthouse's benefit to paying customers, so nobody has a reason to pay. Okay, so again, a public good, something valuable that once it has been set up or once it's been provided, everyone's going to benefit from it. Or if it's not set up, then no one will benefit from it. So you set up a lighthouse somewhere, there's no way to make it the case that only certain people or only certain ships are able to use the light to see where the coast is. Once you turn the light on in the lighthouse, everyone's going to be able to use it. So there's no cost-effective way to limit the lighthouse's benefit to paying customers only, so nobody has a reason to pay. So no one single company is going to want to put up a lighthouse if their competitors are going to use it for free. And if no one pays, markets won't motivate anyone to provide the good. Public goods of this kind are prevalent in modern life. The biggest, most obvious example is national security, which consumes 1/6 of the U.S. federal spending. So if you have a military and say there's some war going on, then it's just going to be the case that everyone who's behind the military on the one side of the border is going to be protected by the military. There's not going to be any practical way to let the military provide protection for some people who are behind the border but not others. Okay, but the same logic applies to infrastructure and fundamental scientific research. Okay, so again, for these things, once they're produced, everyone can benefit from them, the latter of which is the cornerstone for technological innovation. Okay, so since we need these things, since everyone can benefit from them, there's no incentive for a single private company to provide them, so the government has to if you want to get them. Another kind of market failure involves the effects of market operations on people who are neither buyers nor sellers. Economists call these effects externalities, and a classic example of a negative externality is pollution. Okay, so there are positive and negative externalities. It's the negative ones that are our problem. So pollution in an unregulated market, that is, say, where people are producing goods, but the government is letting them do whatever they want. In an unregulated market, neither a factory owner nor a firm's customers have strong incentives to care about what happens to, say, the noxious byproducts of the factory's manufacturing processes. So in an unregulated market, the factory can spew toxins into the air or water with impunity. Okay, so the idea here is the factory, so if there's no government regulation, then who's ever running the factory is going to try to make their product as cheaply as possible, and most likely that's going to include various forms of pollution and possibly, doing enough harm to either locally or globally that people who have nothing to do with the production and are also not buying the products are going to be harmed. Their health is going to be harmed. If they live near a factory where toxins are being spewed into the air or water, the value of their land or their homes may decrease. So those are costs that people who are not involved in making the product or in buying it have to bear. Where such externalities are present, that is where those costs are present, the market prices for goods in question will not reflect the true social costs of the private transaction. Externalities are always an issue, but they become a much bigger issue as economies develop. In dense, complex modern societies, externalities are ubiquitous, and the associated costs of bad market signals are potentially momentous. They include the dangers to the financial system of excessive risk-taking among bankers. So if we have bankers on Wall Street or wherever that are taking excessive risks, that can create harms because it's possible that the entire financial system can be harmed. So the harms that are created by bankers taking excessive risks will be harms to people and costs to people who have nothing to do with what the bankers are doing. So that would again be an externality. The dangers to public health if children are not inoculated against disease or are exposed to brain-damaging levels of lead, and the foregone human potential and squandered economic production if children are not given a quality education. Even the spiral of underconsumption that follows a downturn can be seen as an externality. Everyone retreating from consumer markets at once means more lost jobs and an economy that continues to underperform. What's individually irrational is collectively destructive, and hence governments may need to step in to reverse the slide with counter-cyclical policies. Okay, so the idea here is if an economy is experiencing a recession or depression, the government can step in and try to change that direction, up instead of down. In complex societies, failures caused by incomplete or asymmetrically distributed information, that is when one party to a transaction knows a lot more than another, also become more ubiquitous. Insurance markets routinely fall short, for example, when buyers know more about the risks they face than do sellers. That is, the buyers of the insurance know more than whoever is selling the insurance. And so the buyers then figure out many ways to exclude or limit coverage for those they fear will be costly. This is one reason why publicly provided or subsidized insurance has proved a mainstay of all rich countries, protecting people against risks they cannot protect themselves against, and encouraging investment that entails such risks, such as investment in human capital that might lose value in a dynamic economy where needed skills change rapidly. Okay, so human capital, that would just be workers. So this, I guess, might be unemployment insurance. Okay, then 4, it's not just that information can be incomplete or unevenly distributed, although even broaching the subject invites charges of paternalism. The fact is that people can be very bad at making very important decisions when those decisions are complex, confusing, or involve long-term costs and benefits. As behavioral economics has increasingly shown, myopia, that is short-sightedness, and the difficulty of delaying gratification are important reasons for such negative outcomes as insufficient retirement savings and premature death due to smoking. In this context, government nudges, or even more vigorous pushes, when informed by science and designed to preserve individual autonomy, can be enormously prosperity enhancing. Because governments have chosen to intervene to provide public goods, counter negative externalities, and do some benign nudging, hundreds of millions of lives are now healthier, safer, and better protected against financial risk. In the United States and other rich democracies, the majority of government spending goes to social programs related to health care, Medicare and Medicaid, and retirement, and the majority of regulation involves protection of the public from the operations of unscrupulous private actors. These programs are overwhelmingly popular, even though they are also, as a rule, coercive. That is not a paradox, that's the point, because government is doing things that people need to get done but can't or won't do themselves.